út.
Airbnb ekki allt. Deilihagkerfið býður upp á óendanlega marga möguleika fyrir Íslendinga. Þótt þjóðin sé fámenn, skiptir það engu. Félagsauður, traust, hugmyndaauðgi og fjöldi ferðamanna gerir það verkum að heill heimur tækifæra bíður þeirra sem vilja nýta sér og taka þátt í þessari nýju viðskiptagerð. Þetta skoðun April Rinne, sérfræðings í deilihagkerfinu, en hún vinnur með borgaryfirvöldum allan heim við framgang og skipulag allra mögulegra hliða þess. Og Þóra ræddi við April.
The sharing economy, which admittedly is quite a broad term these days, perhaps too broad, we can talk about that as well, but it's really looking at with the advent of new technologies, and largely social and mobile technologies, the creation of new business models that allow us to share resources with one another, as opposed to looking at them as from outright ownership. So access over ownership is a common saying, and we're really looking at all kinds of assets. How do we share and use resources better? That's everything from our cars and our bicycles to our homes, to office space, our skills, and much more.
Now, here in Iceland, we've had a very fast-growing tourism sector, but the population is quite small. So what opportunities do you see here?
So from where I stand, there's actually a universe of opportunities, and it doesn't require millions of people or even hundreds of thousands of people to participate. It does require a critical mass of people who are dedicated to seeing a platform forward. But I work in cities around the world, small, medium, and large, and different kinds of sharing take place at different levels. But in effect, all of these models are hyper-local. So you can think about sharing that happens within a neighborhood, sharing that happens within a city, within a school group. That's also part of the sharing economy. Tourism itself offers a wonderful jumping-off point for all kinds of sharing. The transportation end of things, the accommodation, but also things like how you see a city, tour guides. There's actually a whole set of sharing economy platforms where individual entrepreneurs can provide tours in different ways, or social eating platforms where instead of going to a restaurant, you can go to the home of an up-and-coming chef, meet new people, have a different exchange of ideas and food. Those kinds of things don't require lots of people. And when I look at the Icelandic culture of hospitality, I think there's a lot of the DNA that's here already that could be tapped into more in the context of visitors, but then also we can look at things that relate to daily life.
But then there is also maybe the downside. We can see with Airbnb where it's partially been taken over by big investors that have whole apartment buildings and are letting them out to Airbnbers. Same with eBay. You just have a lot of big companies that are kind of running the business there. What about regulation and just keeping to the ideals, so to speak?
Keep in mind, for companies, in particular companies like Airbnb, they were not designed for big business, for lots of corporate letting. And the company itself has said that's not what they advocate. And so in some cities, some of those postings are actually coming off the website. But in general, I think what you're pointing towards is where we see the limits of what I would call the sharing economy. When it comes to the human relationship, I think that's what I'm most focused on. And that's where sharing economy companies who are true to their values of community and social impact have a responsibility to make sure that that's the core of the business that happens. In the case of Airbnb, there's a ton, so much happening at the peer-to-peer level as well. So that's where I would say there's a shared responsibility of the companies, of the communities, also of policymakers. That brings me to the second point, where I spend a lot of my time working with policymakers. And really we're looking at a situation where, imagine it, if you will, that we're having to learn how to regulate business models that we've just never seen before. But also understand that the community itself can play a role of self-regulation that's unlike anything we've ever seen before as well, and changes the role of the regulator.
What do you mean by that? Can you explain that?
Great example, we could look at accommodation or transportation. We'll just take that. And I understand that platforms like Uber and Lyft don't exist here. But go back to when we first put in place regulations for taxis. We didn't know who you were getting in the car with. We had no idea about the quality of the car. You didn't have a smartphone. You didn't have GPS. There were lots of unknowns. And wanting to protect your needs as a passenger when you got in this vehicle. Fast forward, and now when you get in the vehicle of an Uber or a Lyft, you know far, far more about who's driving your car. You know exactly where you're going. The company knows where you're going. You know how the driver has been rated before. The driver knows more about you as well. It's not bulletproof. By no means is it a perfect solution, but a lot of those things we used to worry about, you now have access to that information. So, but at the same time, think about something in the case of transportation, again, like insurance. I don't care if the car is shared or you own the car. I want cars to be insured because driving a vehicle is a dangerous activity. So if you think about how we would regulate a ride-sharing platform, yes, we want insurance requirements. Yes, we want to have driver safety checks and so forth. But do we need to have the same level or levels of regulation that we had on traditional taxis when actually the driver and the passenger can know much more about one another? Not necessarily.
But we still need quite a lot of social capital, or at least trust. It's built on trust.
Absolutely. And that's where these platforms themselves, and it's certainly hard to describe to regulators, a little bit more I would say to entrepreneurs and to participants in these platforms. But the fact that many of these platforms, as the more people that use them, the more valuable they become. And each time you have a transaction on one of these platforms, typically you're rating or commenting or reporting back how the transaction went. The more that happens and we build this critical mass, if you will, of social feedback, then that actually does enable people, and this is where it gets tricky to explain, it enables trust to be built in new ways. It enables people to be deemed trustworthy, whether or not, historically it would be whether or not they have a lot of money in the bank, or whether or not they have a lot of degrees. It allows people to just build a reputation and a credibility through these platforms. Now, how do we regulate around that? No one in the world has figured out that, silver bullet. But we're in the process of starting to pick apart regulations and recognize what do we really need to have in place so that, similar to years ago when the car was introduced, we had no idea how to regulate it. None. And we couldn't imagine how we were going to deal with this thing. Now, think about it. Not only have we figured out how to regulate it, we can't imagine life without it. I think that ultimately the sharing economy goes a bit in that direction where it doesn't overtake the economy. It just becomes a natural part of how we meet some of our needs and how we take care of some of our economic activity. Now, the one thing I would say, culturally, there are definitely differences and some challenges, to be quite candid. And the single number one challenge or criteria that will make sharing harder to build wherever you are is if at the societal level there are low levels of trust. If it's a culture or a society where people generally do not trust one another, then not that it won't happen, it's going to take longer, it's going to be a more uphill battle, if you will, and we see that play out worldwide.
Eftir 15 ára leit fann leikstjórinn Ágúst Guðmundsson loksins frumeintækið af kvikmyndinni